Game starts off with the king's pawn opening, also known as e4. Black responds with knight c6, and white responds with knight f3. Now, here's where the game starts to deviate, in that black wants to set a fianchetto up for its bishop, which it does right there, and actually puts pressure on white's rook. In this case, white decides to respond by moving its knight forward and blocking it. And from there on, we have a fight for control of the center, to which black sets up its knight in the center, and white decides to respond by putting pressure with its pawn and moving that forward. And black decides to trade off knights there by capturing white's knight and putting white's king in check, which white most likely to respond, in this case does, by taking with the queen. And now black decides to continue putting pressure by capturing the pawn with the bishop. And white moves its bishop into position to try to put pressure on black in counter response. Black moves its knight forward. And now white castles queen side. And if you look at this board here, you might want to hit pause. You can figure out a good move for black here. Now, if you said bishop g4, you are correct. And it's a good move because it's defended by the knight. And regardless of what white does, white's going to have to make a bad trade-off here. White's either going to lose the queen or the rook. In this case, white would rather give up the rook, so white's going to actually move its queen out of the way and give up the rook there, which black will capture the rook, and then white can retake with its own rook. Now, if you'll notice, black's d4 bishop is hanging, so it decides to capture the f2 pawn. And white decides to respond by moving its knight to d5. Black's next move is castle kingside. And white decides to start putting pressure by capturing the knight and putting black in check. Black responds by recapturing the knight with the pawn. Now, even though white is down material at this point, its basic plan appears to be to use its bishops and queen and rook to overload black's defenses. White moves his queen forward to put pressure on black and also put pressure on the bishop. Black's best move in this case is probably just to move its bishop to protect that piece, which it does. And now white decides to respond by using the pawn storm move to displace the bishop. Black responds by putting white's king in check. And in this case, white will have to move the king out of the way. Now black responds by moving its rook. And white puts the pressure on the bishop. At this point, black's only remaining bishop is marginalized and about to be captured. Black responds with b5, and what it's looking to do, if you highlight both bishops here, is to try to trade off bishops if it can with white, or at least put some additional pressure and possibly buy some time. Now white has three options here. One option is it could simply just take that pawn, and the good thing on that is it can actually put pressure on black to move its rook out of the way. Another option is it could retreat and bring a second defender to the e4 pawn. Now white has a third option, is that it can take the f8 pawn and put black's king in check. Now on its surface it doesn't look like the best option, but if you look deeper, white has a game plan in mind. White decides to go ahead and do that. Black in turn responds by taking the bishop with his king. Here we could start to see white's plan play out. White captures the bishop with his pawn, and black cannot recapture that pawn because that would set up a check. So instead, black decides to move its queen forward and put pressure on white's pawn. White decides to put more pressure by capturing the f6 pawn. And white has a pawn in good position with two defenders on it, both the bishop and queen. Now, black's response here is to simply take the pawn and put pressure on white's queen. If you look deeper, you'll notice there are a bunch of spots that white cannot move its queen. Those would be bad moves for white. So white's essentially going to have to move its queen here. Now, in addition to the pressure on the queen, black is looking to put pressure on white. Now, while it has pressure, it cannot force a checkmate because white has two defenders in the rook and bishop. Both can come to defend the king when it needs to. However, black is trying to assert pressure or counter pressure. White decides to move its queen to the only spot it can, and black moves its pawn forward, setting up a potential pawn storm. White decides to respond by putting pressure. Now here, black's best move is probably to put its pawn forward and block it, but black makes a fatal mistake in moving its king. Now, why is this such a bad move for black? Well, white can respond by moving its queen forward to h6, which it does there. And now black is going to be forced to move its king, otherwise it will be the end of the game. So black moves his king back to where it started, and essentially it gave up two moves for nothing. White, in turn, puts black in check there. Now, if you look closer, you'll notice there's only basically one spot for black to move, which it does there. And now white can simply take the pawn that was going to be used to defend it. Black responds with c6, and now white has to figure out ways to put pressure on black. White decides to put black's king in check there. And in response to that, black decides to defend with its queen, hoping to trade off queens and use its material advantage. The question here is, can you find the checkmating pattern for white here? If you said rook e1 check for white, you are correct. That puts black in a little bit of trouble. Black only has three different ways it can go, and none of them look good. Black decides to go backward, and white responds by moving its queen to h7 to put black's king in check again. Black moves backward to try to defend its rook, and here's a spot where white can end the game in two moves if it does them correctly. Now, if you think it over for a minute, go ahead and hit pause. If you said capturing with the rook and putting black in check, you are correct. Black is forced to capture the rook with its king, because that's the only move it can do. And now white can use the pawn and queen to set up a checkmate there, which it does. And that essentially wraps up our video here. Thank you for watching.